Hey everyone. All right, I love it. I see some familiar faces. People have been on the podcast. People hopefully listen to the podcast. I'm Dave Ferfaro, for people who don't know. We're very excited for this live Pulm PEEPs episode. We're joined by Maria Smilios today, and we're talking about this book. If you haven't read it, Black Angels, The Untold Story of Nurses Who Helped Cure Tuberculosis is awesome. It's a really remarkable story. We're going to go into it a little bit more. And a really fun book because it's like about these amazing nurses. It's about New York. It's about American history. It's about race and medicine. It's really incredible.
And TB.
And TB. How could I not mention TB? And CB Hospital. So we're really excited to dive in. And for people who don't know, Virginia Allen, who's the last surviving Black Angel, who is part of this amazing group of nurses who worked to help cure TB, is being honored by CHEST this and all the other nurses posthumously. And so she may be here a little bit later. There are some other sessions later today, and so please make sure to check them out. But Monty, we're here, we're live, we're recording in person. It's great.
I know, so excited. For those, Furf and I don't work together day to day, but we got to see each other this morning. It was like almost like at ATS when we were across the hall and we like didn't know and like reunited. Did the same thing right around the corner.
Yeah,
so,
slow motion, rocking towards each other. Yeah.
Very slow motion, but we're very excited to be here and wanted to thank the CHEST organizers for doing this. I think it's really innovative. They have 4 podcasts. We're honored to be one of them, to be able to do a live recording. So we'll also get this out for those that are unable to be here in the room today because there's so many great things going on right now. But yeah, super excited for the day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, let's dive in. Do you want to introduce Maria?
Perfect, yes. And we are honored to be joined today by the author, the book author, Maria Smilios, to the show today. Maria is a native New Yorker, but she completed her training here in Boston, where she was able to complete her master's in Master of Arts in Religion and Literature at Boston University. She was also a Luce Scholar, and she taught in the Religion and Writing program. Through her work, Maria found a love for history, medicine, and women's narratives, which inspired, I think, the book and the story today. Maria also worked at Springer Publishing as a science book editor, where she learned about the story of the Black Angels and was determined to really tell this story. I feel like we've been here at the conference so far, and people are like, why hasn't this story been told? We definitely agree, and thank you to Maria for bringing this story to light. She spent it, for those of you who haven't read it yet or planning to read it, you'll find out that she spent years deeply engaged in the lives and stories of those who are closest to these remarkable women. And while The Black Angels is your first book, Maria, we do hope that there are more in the future, and it's really a true honor to welcome you on the show today.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. We'll go back and forth here.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think maybe Virginia Allen just came in.
Yeah.
Right? Thank you so much for being here. It's a real pleasure and an honor. Well, we can't wait to talk more about this amazing story. For those who listen to the podcast, this part will sound familiar, but our standard disclaimer that this podcast is not meant for specific medical advice, and our views and opinions reflect our own and may not reflect those of our respective employers. But let's dive in. So before discussing more details of the book, Maria, we'd just love you to share what led to you becoming an author, and then what inspired you to write this particular amazing story.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I always wanted to write since I was a very little girl, and I learned to read. I always loved story. My father was a storyteller, and I grew up the daughter of immigrants, Greek family, lots and lots of oral history, lots of stories. They chastised me in metaphors, like the Odyssey kind of thing. So it's been, I think by nature I'm a storyteller. What led me to this story was I was working as a science editor at Springer, and I was editing a book on rare lung disease. And the doctor who had written this chapter made an allusion to Seaview Hospital because he was hoping the medication that he was going to try for this would work as swiftly as the cure for tuberculosis did at Seaview Hospital. And that was the line that I read, and I stopped. It was August 2015, and I always had this love for disease and how it moved through cities, particularly New York. So I Googled it, and up came this article about the cure in Seaview Hospital, but tucked alongside of it was another article about Miss Virginia Allen and this cadre of Black nurses called the Black Angels. And I was curious, and I just started, again, I tried to Google it, and I spent days doing this, and was so frustrated that nothing was coming up on the internet about them. So I called on a lark the Staten Island Museum. I had been to Staten Island exactly 2 times in my life, and the woman who answered the phone, I said, do you know Miss Virginia Allen and the Black Angels? And she kind of paused and was taken aback. And she said, why, you don't know Virginia Allen? And I said, I don't. And she said to me, we're doing this grand reopening, and she will be here this weekend talking about these nurses. And so I took my then 4-year-old daughter, and we went. I met her. She gave me her email. And at the time, she was volunteering at the Schomburg. And we started meeting every Wednesday in this little cafe in Harlem Hospital. And we kind of talked about everything except the Black Angels. She's sitting here, but she loves history and art and books. And then slowly but surely, we started talking more about the story, and she invited me to her home, which is, she lives in the Restored Nurses Residence of Staten Island. It's across from the hospital. And I said to her, this is an incredible story, and she said, why don't you tell it? And that's kind of how it unraveled. She introduced me to the family members, and they introduced me to more people, and then Dr. Robachek's son was still alive, so he gave me his father's archives, which we're doing an exhibit later today. You can see I brought some of them up. And they had the listing of the original trial patients. And I started calling people, and I found 2 of them that were still alive. And so they were able to offer this extraordinary perspective on these nurses who cared for them when nobody else wanted to care for them, when they were completely ostracized and stigmatized. So that's how the story came about. I didn't actually set out to write the book. It was just a moment of curiosity that led to 8 years of research in this book.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your inspiration. And I think many of us sitting in the room, it just seems like you came across a question that you wanted to explore more, and so glad that you did. And I know Virginia and many others are thankful for that. You talked, though, spending 8 years going weekly to the cafes and really immersing yourself, talking to, family members, coworkers, looking at the archives. And I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about, when you're writing a story, how do you what's the difference between constructing your story from oral history that you got versus written sources or archives?
So there were no archives on the nurses. Seaview Hospital didn't keep any patient records or archives. There's an image of a room that's waist high, side to side, end to end, with the human resources papers and the patient papers that are turning to pulp. So that story was constructed almost entirely from oral history. There was a lot on Robachek. There was a lot on Salzman-Waxman, who discovered streptomycin, and tuberculosis, obviously. And then there's tons in New York City. I was very comfortable with oral history because I grew up hearing these oral stories, and I love being able to talk to people. I think you can, when you're listening to an oral history of somebody's life, there's texture to it, there's nuance. You can watch how their body language moves when you ask a particular question, one question versus another. How, if you ask them, I always used to open up, tell me about this person. And you watch somebody come to life and become animated, and that's the difference versus like an archive. But when you get a written archive and you look at letters and diaries, those two open up different worlds. So I think for me, I knew I wanted to write this book so it read like a novel. And I wanted those nuances. I wanted to be able to say, for example, like Virginia sat back in her couch and she looked out the window and started to remember. So I think that is like something I wouldn't have been able to do if I was just looking at a diary description. You can't, because it's nonfiction, you can't make that stuff up. You don't have that license that you do with fiction. So I think, for me, being able to sit with people, and then the patients too, to hear their recollection of being in Seaview, and to hear the way their voice, one of them started crying when she remembered the story of her being at Seaview Hospital. She said to me when they gave me isoniazid, she didn't know what it was. She said, at one point I thought, maybe it's better if I die because when I leave here, it's going to be worse, having had tuberculosis and being stigmatized with this disease. So that was a really powerful moment.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like it, and I feel like one thing about reading the book is it really is this enmeshed story. It feels like you created this world where you can try to imagine what the Black Angels were experiencing, what the patients were experiencing, but then also the city is almost a character itself, right? And then you're actually getting some history lessons along the way and some really interesting events that I wasn't aware of. For example, like FDR's son being sick and how that influenced the thought about medicine in the country. So I'm really so curious about your time with Miss Virginia Allen and hearing about her amazing experience. You know, what from the histories that you heard led to this scoping view? You know, did they, were those stories influencing them in real time? Were they part of those stories? You know, their stories are so amazing, and you were able to share them in that light. How did that scoping view come about?
So I think, for me, stories need a backdrop. People need to be set in a time and a place, and I want them to be able to read the book and walk in Harlem in 1935. I want them to hear the sights and the sounds of that time. I want them to understand what it was like to live during the Great Depression in New York City, and then World War II, and all of these big events influence medicine, science, history, and the way we move through the world. The backdrop of New York City was very important for the nurses. That when they were called up from the Jim Crow South, they believed they were going to New York City. They didn't know they were going to Staten Island, which was completely disconnected from New York. Now there's a bridge. Then it was just the ferry. And it was a 5-hour round-trip commute from Harlem, where many of them lived, to Staten Island. So they were also coming up from the South. And it was shocking for a lot of them. The families told me, oh, my grandmother was shocked at how cold it was, or how gray it was, or that there were no trees, you know. And then they got to Staten Island, and it was an island, and it was windy, and there was water around it. So I wanted people to feel their awe at being in a new place as much as they were feeling it. The history of New York is important. The Harlem Renaissance was a wonderful time in New York City, but it was Langston Hughes that said the average Black man did not pay his rent from the Harlem Renaissance. African American people were struggling at the time because of the Great Depression, because jobs that were originally for African Americans had then started to go to white people because they were out of work. And so there was a heavy poverty, and I think it was, his name eluded me just now, another one of these, not Du Bois, major leaders who had likened Harlem to the Bowery downtown. He said that is New York's Upper Bowery, this area on Lenox Avenue where the Savoy Ballroom was, if anyone's familiar. It's way up on 147th Street in that area, Harlem Hospital. So I needed that to be in there, but it was also the seat of activism and this wonderful place where all this, you know, energy was put into striving for equality and equity in healthcare. So that's why it was really important to bring that up in the book and to set these women. They went to Harlem. They used to, you know, Miss Virginia can tell you, she would go dancing in these clubs. So that was also part of their landscape. You know, they went to baseball games. I talk a lot about baseball. They were avid baseball fans. And I wanted that richness of their life not just to be a passing moment. I wanted people to go to the baseball game with them, to smell the, you know, Kentucky bluegrass of Yankee Stadium.
Yeah, and you really get that feel and sense of getting to understand the environment and understand the global circumstances that everyone was dealing with, with the book still being so personal. Again, I should say, Ms. Allen, it's amazing you're here. If you ever want to just come up and talk, we'll just listen. But thank you for joining us so much. Within that stage, Maria, I was hoping, you know, you described this as New York City, 1929, a sanatorium, a deadly disease, and a dire nursing shortage. And so you started talking about some of the social circumstances that created that nursing shortage. But I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about what led to the creation of the Black Angels, what were the circumstances that led to this depleted nursing force, and then especially this remarkable group being created to help care for patients with this deadly disease.
Yeah, thank you for that question. The nurses, the end of 1929, the white nurses began leaving Seaview Hospital. The city had managed through this dedication of, really, it was Herman Biggs in 1903, and then the Commissioner of Health now, to lower the rate of tuberculosis, the death, to 5,000 annually. And it kind of was sitting at that point in 1929 when these nurses left. They left for a variety of reasons. The commute, the mental and emotional toll of the job was a lot. Seaview Hospital was on an isolated hilltop 400 feet above sea level. It was woefully understaffed and underfunded. It was mired in controversy again and again. And so, most importantly, white women had a lot of options for jobs that wouldn't kill them. They could be secretaries, librarians. The New York Telephone Company had just opened this sprawling, this beautiful Art Deco building. And so they left to pursue other jobs. And the city was faced with a crisis. Either they were going to start closing Seaview, or they were going to find a way to staff the waning ranks of nurses. And so somebody came up with an idea and said, well, look, the Great Migration is working. People are going down and recruiting sharecroppers to work in factories and steel mills. Maybe we could do it with the nurses. So they went down, the word went out, went down across the Mason-Dixon line into the American South, and they offered nurses a, quote, rare opportunity to work in a non-segregated New York City hospital. At the time, only 4 of the 29 municipal hospitals allowed black nurses to work. And they offered them a package: free schooling if necessary at Harlem Hospital, a good salary, the opportunity to come to New York. As I said, they thought they were going to New York City, not to Staten Island. And most importantly, the chance to have a professional career, which is what most of these women wanted. They wanted a professional career. They wanted the opportunity to buy a home and be part of the American middle class. And so the nurses began coming. And, over the years, hundreds of them, thousands probably, the city records, thousands of nurses passed through Seaview, but there was a core group that were there for decades. And they became known as the Black Angels. One of them was Miss Virginia's aunt, Edna Sutton. She kicks off the story, would receive Christmas cards. And the Christmas cards would say, they were from patients, you are my Black Angel. And that's how the name came about, from people thanking them for doing the work that they had done. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Maria. And just even, I think, building off of that, I mean, you alluded, like, the recruitment of the nursing workforce was somewhat misleading, to say the least. But I'm wondering if you could even talk a little bit more and extend on some of the challenges that the nursing force had to face, from their own medical challenges, social barriers, as they were working to treat some of the most vulnerable patients in New York City at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So when the nurses came, they found themselves in Staten Island. They found themselves making this 5-hour commute. Originally, Edna was she had to go through a training period at Harlem Hospital, and when she finished, she was still living up in Harlem, and she was doing this 5-hour commute. One of the families told me that Edna worked the night shift, that her grandmother had gotten mugged several times coming home at like 2, 3 in the morning in Harlem. So just to give you an idea, I mean, like, as a woman, I'm not particularly thrilled with riding the subway late at night. But so you get an idea that these women were riding a bus to a ferry to a subway. It was all public transportation. And the ferry port is down in Whitehall Street, which is in Lower Manhattan, and it's a pretty seedy area even now. Then it was filled with what they call Bowery bums and stuff. So you had all of these. That was one thing. The other thing was they faced, the institution. It was a lot of systemic racism that happened. The way the hierarchy of nursing was at the time, it didn't matter if it was a white hospital or a black hospital. There was a white supervisor in power who had these diluted ideas of black nurses that, they considered them, and this is what I was reading, in Atlanta, the supervisor of nurses of Grady Hospital had made a statement that, quote, all black nurses are immoral, they're thieves, they steal, they can't run a ward. which was so ridiculous because it was these nurses that were running most of Seaview. So they had a supervisor who liked to harass them in various ways. She refused requests for people to transfer. She didn't allow her nurses to wear masks. She said masks made them complacent. And then they had the president of hospitals. In 1933, he held a meeting. There were 300 nurse leaders and nurses and city officials, and this fierce activist stood up, Celeria Key, and she said, "Mr. President, why do you send black nurses to Seaview Hospital?" And he said, quote, "We send the black nurses to Seaview Hospital because in 20 years there won't be a colored problem in America because they'll all be dead from tuberculosis." And that pretty much contextualizes why these nurses were sent there and what they needed to contend with the people who were in power. They were seen as expendable in the same way that their patients were seen, as expendable. Send people who most of the patients at Seaview were African American and poor immigrants that had come over from Europe because it was a municipal hospital. So they were sent there to get off of the island to languish and die. And the nurses were sent there to take care of them, and then, as this man said, hopefully they would die too. So that is what they were up against when they were working at Seaview.
Yeah, and it's such an unbelievable contrast to the great patient care that they were taking of people, and to the stories that you share. I think the story of tuberculosis in general is sort of the story of pulmonary medicine. For those who don't know, one of our biggest journals, which I won't name at this conference, used to be called Tuberculosis, right? The history of pulmonary medicine is around this disease. And now I think we think of it was very treatable and very manageable and something we see rarely in a story to talk about. But obviously that's not the history of tuberculosis, probably one of the more devastating diseases in the history of humans. And part of why we're here now is because we have these cures, including isoniazid, and you talk a lot about in the book the clinical trials of isoniazid by Dr. Robacek at Seaview. But often we view it that way. Oh, it's run by Dr. Robacek, and while a remarkable figure, I think we all know that these types of trials cannot be done without people on the ground, with the nurses taking care of patients, documenting, being able to observe and record what they're seeing, and tell you how patients are responding or not responding. So I'm hoping you could talk about the role the nurses played in the clinical trials of isoniazid at Seaview and that sort of integral story.
Absolutely, and I love this question because it's important for so many reasons. Number one, I'm not a nurse. I've had a lot of experience with nurses through both of my parents dying of cancer, but also I had, at one point in my life, I was studying religion and literature at Boston University, particularly death and dying, and I thought of doing palliative care for children, so I volunteered for 3 years at Boston Children's on the bone marrow transplant unit and had this window, this really deep dive into that type of long-term care, which is very similar in a way to TB patients. And I say that because there were kids on that transplant unit for months. One of them was there almost a year. Whether it was straight or in or out, they were living in Boston. TB patients, as some of you or all of you may know, often stayed, I looked at the medical cards, and it said anywhere from 300 days to 1,000 straight days at Seaview. So what those nurses were doing in many ways was palliative care for people at the time when only the rest cure was around, and then there were lots of failed treatments in between. So when Hoffman-LaRoche asked Robacek and Selikoff if they wanted to test isoniazid at Seaview, because for many reasons, it had 1,800 patients, men, women, and children. Miss Virginia worked in the Children's Hospital. I would love it if maybe she might want to get up and say something in a little bit after that. And you don't have to. I don't want to put you on the spot, but they had all different types of tuberculosis. Most people think of TB as a lung disease, but it's not. It affects the brain, it affects the bones, especially in children. It affects the tongue. They had somebody on the trial who had TB of the tongue. His tongue had swelled so big it was hanging out of his mouth. The lymph nodes. So there's all these different areas that the disease can affect. And they were able to choose different, it was mostly done, the INH trials, on people who had pulmonary tuberculosis, but there were like the guy who had it in his tongue, another one who had it in her lymph nodes. And it was never tested on humans. The phone call that he got was the Hoffman LaRoche said, hey, you know that drug that we've been testing on mice? Well, it's showing promise. Do you want to try it on humans? And in 2 days, they said yes, and then the trials were put together something like 6 weeks later. And I will just say this, Robichek was extremely ethical. He did get consent from all of these patients, so I want to just put that out there. This wasn't like a Tuskegee situation. And they had no data. They were kind of flying by the seat of their pants. And if you come to the exhibit where I bring his papers, you can see his, I have his trial records. You can see how he incrementally begins to up the dosages based on weights and the weight and what the nurses were saying. So the nurses, he had said to his son, if it wasn't for the black nurses, none of this would have happened. These nurses knew these patients for 20 years. They knew all the nuances of the disease, how it ebbed and it flowed, how 1 minute you could be fine and the next minute you'd be hemorrhaging. They knew these patients too. They knew their moods. And so when the drug was given, they were not only told, look at their vitals, they were said, look at their mental state, look at their emotional state, look at their body. And every single day they would write down what they saw, what the complaints were. Robichek would collect it at night and then collate it. And that's how they started to say, oh, tinnitus seems to be a problem. A lot of people are reporting ringing in the ear. A lot of people are reporting this voracious appetite, that people were eating huge amounts of food. I kind of, when I started reading 6 eggs, 2 bowls of oatmeal, a carton of milk, I was like, is this true? And it was. And the food bill for CVU went up 40%, the dietary department said, after isoniazid. I mean, people were putting on like 60 pounds in 2 months. There was also this giddiness to it that they started to notice because, was it Marsalid? I think it now is an antidepressant. So people who had been depressed suddenly became giddy. It did cause a little bit of psychosis, but it was all the nurses that took down all this data and handed it over to Robichek, and he began to collate it. And this is how, over 9 years, this drug, because CVU closed in 61. From the time it was tested, it was another 9 years before the hospital closed, came to be, really. Yeah. I mean, there were other drug trials after it was announced by the New York Post. The story was prematurely announced. It was leaked. But yeah, that's really what it was. It was these women who were there on the front lines doing that. Yeah.
I just love that you get to share this story and really show how integral they were in actually, the creation and formation of isoniazid treatment. I want to ask a question focusing a little bit more, though, like on patient and nursing interactions and perspectives. I really loved your comment earlier where you mentioned one of the patients would send a Christmas card and, would say, like, you are my black angel. And I really love that. I'm wondering, though, do you have more information, or can you extend a little bit more on how the patients, many of whom were isolated from society, right, from their own family, how did they respond to the care that they received from the Black Angels as a force?
So I'm not going to sugarcoat anything. There were a lot of patients that didn't like the idea of black nurses taking care of them. They were not immune to the type of racism that existed during that time. But then there were a lot of patients who were so grateful to have these nurses taking care of them, what these nurses did, what one of the trial patients had said to me was, my nurse looked at, it was Missouriya, she had said to me, Missouriya made me feel like a human being again. She gave me back my integrity and dignity. She didn't look at me like, and now these are my words, they looked at these patients like humans. They were not the sum of the disease. These patients were not like the scarlet letter T. And that was important for these people because in any sanatorium, time falls away. And this is a municipal sanatorium. We're not talking about a Saranac Lake with patchwork quilts and, pretty little rural rooms and, there's deer and babbling brooks and that kind of thing. CVU was a municipal hospital. It was a constructed really beautifully. The buildings were gorgeous, but it was a municipal hospital. You know, the inside of it, it was an open ward. There was no privacy. So one patient told me if you wanted privacy, Seaview was not the place to be, right? Everything was out in the open. You know, the patients would find ways to make the time pass. And one of them told me that they played these weird macabre games where they listened to the stats like sputum counts and fevers, and then they would take bets who would die first. So this is what was going on in the wards. You know, there was a lot of depression. Children were not allowed up on the adult wards. So mothers would, and fathers, but it was mostly mothers. The children, if they came to visit, would be downstairs, and they would have to go to the window and wave to them, and that was extremely painful. And one of the patients told me there was a mom on her ward who just wept and wept and wept all day long. But it was the nurses that sat with them. One patient told me that she remembered these like fever dreams, but she loved reading. She wanted to be a librarian. And she remembered her nurse reading The Good Earth to her in between this fevered state. So that's the kind of care that they did. I mean, it was long-term bedside care. It wasn't just kind of going in, changing, you know, pajamas or sheets, cleaning somebody up. They sat, they listened, they were their confidants. I mean, the role that they played was not just nursing. It was psychiatrist, psychologist, and it was every other, you know, team of, now you have these teams of people who come down and can, patient advocate, you know, they were fiercely protective of their patients for them to get the right care, while also trying to advocate for equal pay and housing and the ability to buy a house and live on a street where they wanted to do. So that was happening outside of the hospital, as well as also having fun because they enjoyed themselves, you know, they did have lives.
Yeah, and you talk about, you know, the role of not just being a nurse. I mean, I can't really imagine taking care of an inpatient for, you know, 500 days, right? You know, we might see a patient, we take care of them for 2 weeks, and you feel like you know them really well. I mean, this is like you're taking almost a community within a hospital. Well, all of this is so well, you know, described in the book. I really encourage people to read it. I do want to ask you about some more modern topics that maybe you have a really interesting perspective on, having heard these stories. You know, at this time, tuberculosis really was a pandemic, and we unfortunately have, you know, lived through a different type of pandemic with our COVID pandemic. But while there are many differences, there are some similarities of, you know, hospitals being filled, especially in New York City. I know I was there, and I think you were living there at the time as well, of a disease that didn't have a cure, a disease that people were afraid of, and, you know, were not great about understanding how it was spread, and people trying to take care of them. So I'm curious if you, from as you were writing this and learning this story, saw any differences or similarities in how society or the medical field responded to the COVID pandemic as compared to tuberculosis so long ago.
I love this question. Thank you for asking it. I can go on for hours about this question, but I'm going to condense it. I originally started this book in 2016 when Barack Obama was president. The country was moving towards what looked like a more unified, equitable healthcare system. And so the landscape, when I thought of the book and the cultural moment that we were in, was different. Then he wasn't president, and the country moved again towards a great divide, and healthcare and health inequities grew and grew and grew, and there was this animosity and division. And so then that informed the way I was going to write it. I kind of threw away that iteration of the manuscript and wrote a second iteration, and then COVID happened. I was living a mile from Elmhurst Hospital, that famous hospital where you saw the lines snaking around the block, where the nurses were wearing garbage bags because they ran out of protective equipment. And I remember one day we'd walk out of my house and I'd see the morgue trucks, and I saw these lines, and I wasn't writing at the time. My daughter was home from school. We were like, this was in the very beginning of the pandemic, and sometime a couple of months after, it was like late spring actually, and I had this moment and I thought, this book, when I saw those people and I saw these nurses on the front lines and the fact that they didn't have protective equipment and how people started to, you know, there was a lot of anger because you couldn't get into the hospital, you wanted to be treated and you weren't able to see your loved ones, and it was being taken out on these frontline workers. And I started thinking, my goodness, the parallels here are the same, and this is really a book about who lives and who dies based on the zip code in which you live. And that's where I got this third iteration, which eventually became the book. I mean, the parallels are almost uncanny. I remember at one day I called Miss Virginia, and I was speaking with her, and she said, open your windows, make sure you get that fresh air in, which is what they did with tuberculosis. And I started thinking to myself, this is what it must have felt like to live in a time where there was no cure for a disease. People didn't know what we were. Not me, I wasn't on the front lines, but they didn't know what they were doing. They were trying the best that they could with what they knew. So yeah, there were incredible parallels. Also the fact that there was an attempt to make the disease racialized, by calling it an Asian disease. TB was a social disease of poverty, and it was the people that were blamed for it were African Americans, and then also immigrants. Who were considered, quote, as I say, immoral, uncouth, un-American, uncultured. So those parallels, sadly, were there as well.
Yeah, and I think you covered it well. A lot of the unfortunate parallels we see, and I think there were some things during the COVID pandemic about supporting essential workers, but there was also a lack of what that is, right? Like, what is the type of support, and especially I can imagine in a more drawn-out, prolonged pandemic, a career of supporting these patients on the front lines, they almost don't get viewed in the same way as essential workers and with the same sort of support.
Okay, sorry. I just love that you can tell this story. And I've said on the show before, I did nursing before I did medicine. So I think I really appreciate how you talk about how this workforce really helped with the evolution of TB cure. Probably we'll ask one last question before we open it up to anyone here in the room. This could be a two-step question. But how do you think the story of the Black Angels shed light on the broader racial inequities in healthcare system of the 20th century? And second part for that, how do you think this story is going to change how we view the role of race and gender in the evolution of public health?
So I'm going to answer this by what I hope will happen, not what I think is happening. I think it's important. History is important. We all know history is important. It's important to get it right. It's important to give people and their rightful place in history, and to look at how their role in history plays out. And I think shining a light on these nurses, and I'm going to answer your question, I think, in a twofold manner. I hope by shining light on these nurses, it will inform nursing history and what's taught in nursing schools. I know from doing a lot of these talks, nurses have told me they only hear about Florence Nightingale. I hope that changes. The TB world, I hope that, and they have been so welcoming with this story and wanting to incorporate it into the history of tuberculosis and into that narrative. Dr. Robacek won a Lasker Award. He had these accolades, shined on him, and it's deserving, but as he said, it wouldn't have been possible without the nurses. So I hope they also have the opportunity to have, some light shined on them. I know Chess did that with Miss Virginia yesterday, and I'm so happy for, the organizations that have done that for the Black Angels and for, Miss Virginia Allen. So I hope it will help us see that healthcare, you can't divorce the racial inequities in healthcare. They exist today. That type of racism is still around. So I hope it will open up conversations. For me, I teach English, and books are such a beautiful pathway to have difficult discussions. You can open up a book and say, let's talk about this, and you don't actually have to bring yourself to it because you can pull a character from it. So I hope it will do that. I hope it will open up these conversations with organizations, or if people want to talk about race and medicine. And then the second question was the takeaway of, was that what you, or?
Role of race and gender in the evolution of public health.
Oof.
Wow.
That's
a tough one.
It's a tough one. It's a long one.
Yeah.
At the time when this book took place, it was all men. It was all men running the public health department in New York City and really across the country. I hope that changes too. I'm heartened to see there are more and more women involved in public health. So that's the short answer. I just want to keep time because I know people might have questions. Because I could go on about that too.
Yeah. But this is a great conversation. We appreciate all of your insights, both in how you're writing the book and then sharing more background and amplifying these unbelievable stories. We do like to end each episode with a takeaway. We'll sort of treat this like our regular episode and do that, and then we'll go to some questions. A takeaway I think I took from this, it's really interesting parallel reading a book about medicine written in this way, as opposed to practicing it. And just the patient stories and then the nursing interactions with the patients, both patients that were respecting them and patients that weren't, really jump off the page and are just such a reminder of the importance of doing that and being present in the moment, and how even, 50, 100, 150 years later, those are the things that elevate and come out and matter in the context of this broader patient care. Made me try to be more present in the moment of caring for patients and when I'm there with my patients and having observations. Christina, takeaway.
I know this is I feel like it's cheating, but just the entire story, right? Like I said, several people yesterday were like, why hasn't this ever been told? Like, why isn't it in books? Why isn't it in classes? So just the fact that we can now move forward with this and introduce that as, should be part of curriculum and learning for all. So just thank you for sharing the story.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anything that you took, a final takeaway from today's conversation or from reading the book?
So in the end, I always say that this is a story of triumph. It's a story about these extraordinary women who really embodied what it meant to do humanitarian work. I will say this, we moved to Asheville, North Carolina in the second winter of the pandemic, and the reason I'm going to say, and now, Asheville is kind of decimated, but there are nurses going on horseback to the mountain towns that can't be reached because there are no roads and no water and no cell service. And it reminded me a lot of these women because they, too, really are embodying what it means to be human. And the terrain that they're going on with the horses is not easy now because it's littered with debris and there's dangers of mudslides and all this kind of stuff. So the Black Angels, one reviewer I think put it the best. She said, there's anything we can take from this book is that the Black Angels teach us to be better human beings now and in the future. And I just love that quote. And so that's kind of what I'm going to leave you with, because I do think reading this book, it is inspiring. And they are remarkable women, and they did extraordinary things at a time when women were not in medicine. They were not supposed to be on the front lines of drug trials, and these were Black women on the front lines of drug trials. So that that layer also makes it incredible. So I hope everybody takes something positive away from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us and having this episode. We want to thank Chest for inviting us and allowing us to be part of this story. Mostly we want to thank Ms. Virginia Allen for telling her story and for being here. Maybe we can all give a round of applause.
I was going to say, Miss Allen, you have no obligation, but if you want to share a takeaway, feel free.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
We appreciate you being here.